we start with the live streaming now and start with the second plenary session of the conference. Well, yesterday I think we had the idea or the approach to look into different world regions in terms of where are we heading in forest management. Where is it, so what do we mean with integrating multiple ecosystem services? What are the strategies? Where is policy going? What are forest management practices? And of course it was this, to be expected, huge diversity of perspectives related to different regions. I mean, it's hard to compare, let's say, UK or Denmark. I was in a presentation yesterday with Russia, for instance. But at the same time, there have also been some interesting similarities about people and forest management, about climate change challenges, and so on. This morning, we choose a different approach. The idea for the plenary is now that we do not so much take into account the regional perspectives, but that we have invited 4 distinguished keynote speakers to present different disciplinary views coming out of the research community on this question of forests managed and governed for multiple ecosystem services. And I would now shortly introduce the 4 speakers and explain what perspective they take up. And I would like to start with Eva Primmer with 2 E's, which I think was confused somewhere in the program. Eva, she will talk about the political science perspective to how forest governance addresses the controversies of preservation, sustainable use, and restoration. Eva is now research director of the Finnish Environment Institute, which is a big institute with many, many different things to deal with. But I know it's not here, that she has a forestry background. She has worked a lot on biodiversity conservation and forest issues. She is also adjunct professor in environmental policy at the University of Helsinki, holds many other important positions, which I have not the time to introduce now. But I'm really happy, Eva, that you could make it to this conference and that we could bring you back to your original or core research sphere, forest biodiversity policy. And we expect you to present us a bit the perspective of political science. What can we learn from political science? Thank you, Eva. Then there's Jette. Where is Jette? Jette, great. Jette, she will talk about an economics perspective on drivers and outcomes of forest management approaches for multiple services and will explore different perspectives. And obviously to do this, you need to be a professor in environmental and resource economics, which Jette is at the University of Copenhagen. And she's also a scientific expert of the Danish Economic Council and a member of the Danish Council for Climate Change. And I think Jette is here really to introduce to us how do economists research and think about governing and managing forests for multiple ecosystem services. And as Denmark is currently the chair of the Integrate network, we learned a lot about Danish forestry and forest policy in the last year. And it will be interesting if you include that also in your presentation. Well, and then I think I'm in the order more or less. Klaus, next to me here, Klaus Puettmann. He is talking about putting the horse before the cart, ecosystem service-driven silvicultural research. So obviously his perspective is to come from a silvicultural perspective. So what can we, from silvicultural research, contribute to this question of managing forests for multiple ecosystem services? This is actually at the core of silvicultural research, so I think he is well positioned for that. But I think knowing Klaus, I would expect that he also goes a bit beyond that and covers more ground. And because he's a broad person, he is an Edmund Hayes professor in silvicultural alternatives in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at Oregon State University, working on silviculture, stand development, spatial dynamics, plant interactions, and many other interesting issues. But importantly, he's also a person that's well connected to the planet, more or less. So he has collaborated with students and colleagues from all 5 continents. I was trying to count this morning if a continent is missing, but probably one without trees. And is a honorary member of the Italian Academy of Forest Sciences and the Royal Swedish Academy of Forestry and Agriculture. So, and finally, we have Pierre Ibisch sitting on the very left here. And because we are missing other academic perspectives, but we thought what is importantly missing is also a conservation perspective, a strong conservation perspective. So we invited Pierre to take this up. He will talk about forests and multiple ecosystem services, an ecosystem-based conservation perspective. And Pierre is an ecologist and professor for nature conservation and research professor of ecosystem-based sustainable development, director of the Center for Econics or Economics? Econics. Yeah, I was thinking, so economics, I would be surprised. And ecosystem management at the Eberswalde University for Sustainable Development. And also, this is not in his CV, but Pierre is also a very vocal person in the debate on conservation, multiple-use forest management in Central Europe, and I think he's well positioned to cover that from a conservation research perspective. Well, this is enough from my side. We really look forward to inspiring talks. We said that with regard to the time, we will discuss the talks directly after the talks and give room for question, answer, and statements. So we look forward what we learn, what different disciplines can contribute to the big question we are interested in. And with that, I hand over to Gesche, who will help us through the morning. Thank you.
Actually, I don't have anything more to say than I would like to ask Eva to start her presentation. I will be in charge of the timekeeping a little bit, and that's my role for the morning. So I'm a bit relieved after yesterday that Georg has most of the responsibility. No, you will stay here. I will just ask you then to come to the stage. I will moderate the discussion, and yeah, and there might be some short final remarks from Georg. Right. Okay, Eva.
Okay. Microphone, so I will be constrained to the space too. Yeah, that's
yes,
okay.
Otherwise, I mean...
No, it's good. It's okay. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for your kind presentation, Georg, and thank you for the invitation. Nice to see you all. My talk is going to use the political science perspective throughout, so it's not, I'm pinpointing to it only in a couple of points. I want to acknowledge the different projects that have allowed me to work on the topics that I will be talking about, and the numerous colleagues, of course, who are without whom this wouldn't have happened. So it's, I'm presenting work that is collective in some ways. So I regret that I was not here yesterday. I looked at the Twitter just to get a bit of a feeling, and there are some great talks that I have missed, and it would have been wonderful to be here. You were talking about forests, and I am assuming that the imagery that you had in your mind was not something like this, what I have on the first slide. Perhaps it was something more like this. The multiple functions of forests include also people. We are thinking of forests as something that we benefit from, that we enjoy, that we can live in or live nearby, that different industries and livelihoods relate to and depend on. Forests have multiple functions. They retain nutrients from agriculture and otherwise. They slow down nutrient cycles. They retain water. They control erosion. They sequester carbon. They stock carbon. And yeah, we all love to go to the forest. They provide us recreation as well. Now I will go into discussing ecosystem services from two different angles. And I start with a paradigm or an area that has biodiversity conservation as a starting point. And from there, I go into thinking of how forestry or forest management relates to similar questions. Not exactly the same questions, because the two areas in some way don't address exactly the same questions. And this is, I will do this by looking at ecosystem services. And I will show you with some arguments that, and I hope you see the text probably quite well, with some arguments that are typical in the ecosystem services discussion, and some counter-arguments that are also very typical. And those counter-arguments kind of come from the biodiversity conservation angle more than anything else. So a typical argument would be that ecosystems provide benefits for humans. Forest ecosystems provide benefits for humans. And the counter-argument would be, no, this is a terrible utilitarian approach. It commodifies nature. there is an argument that understanding the value of ecosystem services would lead to better decisions, to better governance, better management of those ecosystems, that we need to understand the value. But the counter-argument would be, no, focusing on the value leads to monetization, and then you will compare those values, and you will actually then focus on the ones where the monetary value is easy to identify, and then you would give in somehow to market forces which have already caused unsustainability. Well, in the ecosystem services community, if you like, or discipline, sub-discipline, there is an idea that paying for providing ecosystem services would improve sustainability, that you could target payments in such a way that the management of the ecosystem is more sustainable. Well, the counter-argument is that no, this would just liberalize something that sustainability would need to be governed with regulation and controlling action rather than stimulating more action and paying for something that might be there already. And to forest owners and managers who might perhaps be required to have the same behaviors that we are now wanting to pay for. A more recent, a more sort of like emerging idea that comes also from the more climate-oriented discussions is that ecosystem service loss should be compensated, and biodiversity loss should be compensated by those who caused the damage. So because damage was caused by some human action, those who damage should be accountable and pay for the generation or conservation of ecosystem services, and actually very much pay for restoration of ecosystems. The counter-argument to this goes that those who cause the damage, by paying for someone, paying a compensation for someone else to generate the better ecosystem services or restore the ecosystem, would actually just give a license to operate to the damager. Okay, let us move to looking at these issues more from the forest side, or forestry, or forester side, if you like. Now I challenge you to think, are there these controversies within forestry? So the forestry, like you probably have discussed yesterday, that forests have multiple functions. This is like a typical framing of the similar issues. And to have these functions, you need trees. So the forest is actually something you need to maintain. You need to have trees. Without trees, you don't have the functions. These functions can be supported with management, so that you can have management, and you just need to tune the forest management so that it would consider all these different functions, and this is possible. Policies should support management for multiple functions, and policies should be formulated so that the profitability of forestry, of the core idea of having the trees grow in the forest, should be somehow not undermined. So forestry is somehow a starting point. These are very subtle differences. This is not a controversy. This is not a heated debate. This is in some way how forestry addresses these issues. And I would say that there is very little controversy within forest sector on these ecosystem service and forest multiple functions issues. I thought that I would just flash this just to illustrate that there is a lot of literature highlighting the controversy around biodiversity and ecosystem services, and there is fairly good political science, if you like, analysis of how the forest sector integrates different aspects and somehow treats them in a non-controversial fashion, if you like. Okay. Now I will then pinpoint to something that I see that the difference in these two different argumentation lines. The underlying idea in the more biodiversity-oriented research community and policy community is preservation. You should set aside large areas. A couple of years ago, there was a big movement coming up towards the biodiversity post-2020 policy, sort of argumenting to the post-2020 policy, which is being, by the way, formulated in Rome as we are sitting here. This movement was saying that we should save half Earth for nature, and this would preserve 86% of those species that would exist if nature had all the Earth to use for itself without us humans. Anyway, this kind of land-sparing idea is the underlying idea. The more forestry-oriented idea is not the same. It's kind of like land sharing. The same areas, or even like a very tiny a conglomeration of tiny patches of areas that are integrated across the landscape could produce all the different services. And this is often called sustainable use. This idea is really strengthening itself also in the biodiversity policy area, but this is something that the forest sector has had in its discourse for a very long time. And these are quite different aspects. But then there is another aspect. It's good we are here in Bonn now. There is the initiative of forest restoration. And forest restoration, I want to challenge this now that forest restoration has become quite sort of topical. But forest restoration, among those who have worked with forest restoration or combating forest degradation and managing the entire continuum, has a very strong disciplinary background and a very strong knowledge base. And there are these huge efforts to restore more forest. 150 million hectares, 350 million hectares. But this is becoming much more political now. Last year there was this paper saying that you could plant trees on an extra close to 1 billion hectares. And then by doing that, you would actually mitigate climate change in a very, very important way. This paper caused a lot of debate, but I would say not among foresters. I participated in the IUFRA World Conference in Brazil in October, and there was not a devoted session on this topic. There were maybe some mentions about this paper, but not as an item on the agenda. But there is a huge debate about how trees could save us from climate change. And the forestry community could perhaps participate in this debate more. I will just say, I'll tell a little story if I have time now. In Finland, there is a petrol station entrepreneur who is super innovative. He has, and he's a millionaire, and he has been the forerunner of biofuels. And this guy has now entered this trees debate, and he is going to afforest Sahara. And foresters are not participating in the discussion about his ideas. Okay, in forestry and in the climate change, so this is from IPCC, we understand that restoration is much broader than just planting trees in Sahara or in new areas. Restoration is very much bringing the degraded ecosystems to a more sustainable level, and it's a gradient of different activities. Okay, so when I had these illustrations of how the ideas go, I claim that restoration brings in a new idea where the frontier of forests is disappearing in a lot of places. There are a lot of forest fires, there is a lot of conversion of land, there's degradation of land that eventually gets converted to agricultural use, but at the same time there is this huge discourse on planting new trees and generating new forests. And perhaps we could, if these were called land sparing, land sharing, this approach could be called land settling, so that you can always perhaps sacrifice some forest, but then you would generate new forest. And there is this idea that those who actually generate, who take off forest, this is from a mine in northern Finland, they would then compensate by restoring forest somewhere else. And the compensation is, the offset that is generated somewhere else could be done by someone else, the landowner or the land manager, and actually this compensating actor, this harm doer, would just pay for this activity, so they could pay themselves out of the sort of burden of managing sustainably. Okay, this has been this sort of narrative where you haven't perhaps noticed that I am talking political science. What would political science offer to this kind of burning sustainability debates? Political science focuses on who are the actors, and how the actors operate and debate and change management practices or political discourses. So they look at processes as well. Political science looks at weights, so not at cubic meters, not carbon equivalents, but the sort of weights that are placed on issues. So the policy emphasis or the discourses that form around different issues. Political science identifies sources of stability, which are often called rules. Also, informal rules and practices are a point of interest, but also of friction, when these rules are incompatible or when practices are incompatible or when there are sort of new ideas challenging the old stable rules. Political science looks at organization of issues, not just organizations, but organization of issues and asymmetries, so the different roles of different actors, the rights that they hold, the responsibilities that are placed on them, and very much on power asymmetries as well. And so political science is very helpful in structuring issues, in structuring controversies as well, and perhaps structuring this kind of hidden controversies that I was illustrating that might be the sort of dominant approach in the forest sector. So in political science is most helpful when it is empirical. And here are some of my own papers where we had looked at these same phenomena that I have been talking about empirically. And I will just illustrate one from this where we look at biodiversity offsetting, where we looked at the different compensation mechanisms, and you won't see the small text, but just there are different mechanisms. The government could organize the compensation mechanism so that they enforce the damaging industries or developers, they're often called, to pay a compensation, and the developer would pay then to the landowner or to an intermediary who then organizes the deal with the landowner. Or you could have a habitat bank or a bank-like system so that the government actually has just designed the rules, but this operation happens with a bank. Or you could have direct interaction. In this study where we looked at this in Finland, and we used literature as well, we noticed that the role of citizens was very weak in this analysis and in the discourse in Finland. Okay, I'm coming to a conclusion. So what I want, the messages that I want to now just drill into the audience are that political science would ideally support all of this, the deliberation and an increased understanding of biodiversity and ecosystem services, the trends and benefits and costs, so how things are developing, who benefits, who loses, and in the current system, and if we bring in a new mechanism like, say, the offsetting. And who are the losers and who are the beneficiaries. And how preservation, sustainable use, and restoration relate to each other, so that we wouldn't look at them as different boxes and be talking only about one at a time rather than the whole big picture. So to reach a shared understanding, I think that we need political science, or political science can support this kind of deliberation, but first we need understanding, and for that we need deliberation. So this is my take-home message. Addressing the open controversies and the more hidden, sort of suppressed controversies is a precondition for developing sustainable governance of ecosystem services in forests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva, for this enlightening talk. Being a political scientist by background myself, I found this a very important contribution. We have 10 minutes for discussion and questions or comments now. And we have the two colleagues from IFSA supporting us here with the microphone. So please feel free to raise your hand.
Thank you very much for wonderful presentation. I have one question. When you mentioned about land sharing in forest ecosystem of Finland, can you clarify? You are very short, but maybe you can clarify. What do you mean land sharing in forestry, in forest ecosystem of Finland?
Okay, thank you. It's a good clarifying question. I was thinking much more of the global debate of land sharing, of the idea that the multiple functions are generated in the same landscape. So there is a huge literature on this, whether you should do the sort of land sharing ideas in parceled fashion, so that you would have patches producing timber and patches perhaps for something else, or whether you should integrate all the provision of all the different services, all the different forest functions in the entire landscape. So if you did this, you would perhaps sacrifice the sort of most nature-like features if you manage the entire landscape for sustainability, because you would then have the more people functions in the forest. But yeah, I am not an ecologist, and maybe we hear more about this type of ideas. But this is not a very Finnish perspective. Or if I say in Finland, the idea is that the same forest can produce all the functions, but the Finnish forestry allows clear cuts as well, that then there is just an idea that because all the species are native and the rotations are so long and we have buffer zones and we have small patches, that is sustainable. That's kind of the sustainability idea in Finland. And it differs a little bit from Central European.
Maybe participants are still tired from the intense day yesterday, but there's another question.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering about the idea of compensating in forest ecosystem. In the example you show, basically the forest is destroyed. So what could compensate for such a damage to the forest ecosystem? What kind of restoration? And do you, maybe a bit provocatively, really believe that compensation in forest is possible?
This is a very good question, and I illustrate it with this kind of like absolute destruction picture, because this is where the kind of operationalization of ecological compensation is being formulated. So it's integrated into permits of those who actually destroy. Where could that be then? Where could we have restoration such that it would actually then generate new forests that would replace all those values that were lost is really challenged, whether that's possible at all. But so in countries where you have, say, in Finland we have peatland that has been converted first to peat use and then to forestry, and restoring this land is a great way to take back some of the ecosystems that have been managed so intensively to more natural ecosystems. But if you wanted to offset the same values that you lost in this site, that would be impossible. And for this reason, the offsetting literature is very focused on what kind of factors do you need to consider. That do you need to then multiply the area by so many times, like 10 times more of hectares, so that you get more nature values. Why this is also attractive for governments is that there is a lot of restoration debt that has been identified, that we have all these degraded ecosystems and they need to be restored, and no one is interested in paying for that restoration, or the governments feel that this is very costly. So they are also interested in the offsetting mechanism, so that they would get some money to this restoration that has been kind of promised in a lot of policies. So I'm sorry if I sound like a proponent of the idea. I don't know if I am. Like, I think that in some cases where you are destroying something, it's great to rip off some of the, I mean, that the damager should pay for the damage that they cause. This should, of course, be the case, but I don't know how it can be organized in an ideal way.
I have there's a question from the audience, and I would ask you kindly to introduce yourself briefly before you speak.
Can I still add up to that comment?
Yes,
Yes,
you can.
Sometimes there is an idea that forestry, that the clear cuts in forestry or like doing forestry should be compensated as well. And this is super difficult to then assess what proportion of that forestry is so damaging that then something would change more nature-like elsewhere, or like more sort of nature managing-like, and it's kind of a gray zone, and that's why also why this like total destruction is a good starting point for thinking of offsetting.
Okay, this will be the last question now.
Yeah, great.
No, I have pressure. Hi, I'm Laura. I'm from the European Forest Institute, and being from Finland myself, I was very interested in this, and it is a bit specific question related to Finland, because we are very proud as a country of our sustainable forest management, but at the same time, most of our most common forest species are critically decreasing. So from the 1950s, most of our most common species have dropped dramatically in their presence in the nature. But I feel that we are not really recognizing this in the forest industry, and we have still this very strong ethos on like, this is how we do, and all the world should do exactly like us. So I'm just wondering, like, what is your opinion? How do you see a way forward for us to kind of reconcile this, that we are actually losing forest species, and how do we kind of still start to recognize that our system is maybe not so good as we thought it would be?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and the answer is, of course, on my last slide. But the dilemma in Finland is that most of the forest area is under management. So all those species that need very pristine conditions, they are degrading, or their populations are degrading, and we have loss of those species. So in some way, Finland hasn't had a lot of the preservation idea in all habitat types, and this is like some of the preservation instruments should be used. So that's Finland's dilemma. But at the same time, when there is, so then the biodiversity community will come and say that forestry has caused all these species devastation and doesn't acknowledge what the forest sector is doing, so it's leaving retention trees or doing nowadays, there's a lot of pilots of these like large stems so that to generate more coarse woody debris. There is a claim from the biodiversity species community, like research community and activists, that does nothing. So in some way there is a huge distrust as well, that when these activities that the sector has done are challenged in such a sort of dramatic way. So yeah, you would need more deliberation. Yeah. Very good.
Thank you very much for this enthusiastic final statement. I would like to ask Jette to come to the stage now. Reagiert er nicht, oder?
Ja, doch, der hat aber einfach jetzt auf Splitscreen umgestellt, was er nicht sollte. Ich weiß nicht, wie er es gemacht hat.
Weißt du, wie du zurückkommst? Hier drüber. Genau.
Duplicate. Ja, now it should be.
Ja.
Okay.
Okay, I have to stand here. Thank you for the invitation to come and tell about an economic perspective of this. I have to say that I actually don't think economics alone can solve and tell us how we should do multifunctional forestry. So I will take sometimes a little bit a narrow perspective to say what economic perspectives is there on the topic. But I actually think that economists cannot really solve this, but we can inform some of the decisions that we look into. So the way, and that is what Eva just said in the beginning, the way economists looks at forests is that it provides utility to us as people, both spatially and over time, and for different groups of people. And this utility is what we're interested in. It can be utility related to timber that we extract, but it's also a utility related to conserving biodiversity, for example. If we find it important as human beings to conserve biodiversity, then biodiversity has a value, and that is something that we can include. So during the presentation, when I talk about economics, it's not only marketed stuff, it's all things that we find valuable. And then that is, of course, one of the challenges. So I will talk a little bit about some of the drivers of change, how that lead into a land-sparing, land-sharing discussion, and what economists can say about that. Then I will talk slightly about adaptation and this perspective of, are we managing forests for the future, or for today, or for a mix? And then also, I think, when we talk about multifunctionality, then we need to look outside the forest, and we do not only need to look outside the forest at a larger landscape level, but actually at a larger societal level, and looking into what is the interplay between the activities and the utility we get out of the forest and from elsewhere in society. So basically, forest has only got a value if it gives us products, it can give us health. If there's a health benefit of moving around in the forest, it can give us happiness that we know that species are doing well. But this is, as I said, the underlying economic view on it. If we want to understand changes and how we derive utility from that, well, then we also need to understand what are the changes that we're seeing, not only inside the forest, but also outside. So can we actually substitute jogging in the forest with going to the fitness centers? Well, it's not only a question of whether we can or not, but also do people actually do that? Is a cinema, visit to the cinema, well, that is for many a substitute of a Sunday walk. How should we spend the time today? Okay, let's look at what options are there. And I think also what we see increasingly is this idea of adventure activities for, again, this Sunday walk idea, which takes place in nature, but it also takes place in cities. Escape rooms are becoming increasingly popular. It's a question of doing something together, but it substitutes something else, and this we have to acknowledge and be aware of when we decide on how to manage our forests. In economics, we have a very well-developed way of looking at these trade-offs, because that's the price of the good. The price of the good tells us how much is it worth relative to something else. If I can buy a cheap cup of coffee and I get a piece of cake, or I can choose to buy the expensive cup of coffee, well, then the expensive cup of coffee and the cake, that is the trade-off that I'm doing. So the price is very simple. We have the solution to everything. No need to go any further, right? Why discuss trade-offs? And one of the reasons is, of course, that this market is not well functioning. So the price that we see on the market does not reflect the trade-offs that we are looking at. And I think this is what we do in forest economics and what we can also contribute to, that is to try to say, how can we understand these values such that they actually reflect the trade-off? If we look at what role and how do these trade-offs changes over time, then this graph, I don't know if the author is even in the room, but it basically shows the world consumption of different forest products. And then the blue bars here are the GDP, so the measure of wealth for societies. And when I was studying in the 90s, it was a very clear saying that, you know, the amount of paper that we cannot change. Nowadays, we have computers, and still we can see that paper consumption and development are so closely related. So forests need to continue providing paper. Then something happened, and now we zoom into US data, because here we can see this is the consumption of paper in the US, and here we have the development of internet, what is the proportion of people in the US who have internet access. And what we can see is, well, it was not the computers that changed our consumption of paper, it was actually our access to the internet. What does that tell us? Well, if we go back to the figure here, we can see that, well, it's right, this followed the GDP quite well, but what happened is just we used the forest products for something else. So this is very good, right? It showed that we did not have a collapse in the forest production just because we couldn't produce paper any longer. We just changed the product. This is well known for many foresters. That's why we produce multiple products. We can substitute one with the other, and by that we always adapt to the needs of society. That's one of the strengths we have in forestry. But to do that, we also need to allow for changes in the forest and the forest management practices. And if we then zoom in on a much smaller country, namely the case in Denmark, then since the 90s we have had an enormous increase in the use of energy, of wood for energy consumption. So what you can see here is the green ones, that's our use of wood for roundwood production, and then the gray one here is the amount of wood that is just being produced for energy. And that's a very, very fast change, right? And it's a very fast change in a very short time from a forestry perspective. Is that a problem? Well, of course it causes that our forests change, because this wood does not come from nowhere. Part of it might be leftovers that were not used before, that changed the forest. Part of it may be trees that were otherwise left for dead wood. That's an ongoing discussion now. Is it actually, are we burning the wood that would otherwise have been there for dead wood? And some is coming from other products, and some of it is actually coming from outside the forest. So these marketed good changes, but we also know that the non-marketed good changes, and we know surprisingly little of that. One of the studies, again from Denmark, that some of my colleagues is looking at is into the recreational options or possibilities and use in the 70s and up until today. And what they're saying in broad term is that the number of visits is approximately unchanged, but we see that people have shorter visits and shorter distances. That, of course, means that the usage of the forest changes over time, and we need to adapt our multifunctional forest to that. Likewise, if we go for another ecosystem service that we may look at is the water. Here, the green line here, that is showing us what is the price development of water. And that is relevant because that tells us about what is the demand and what is the scarcity of this water. So that's a measure of saying water consumption is becoming increasingly important. That, of course, has an importance of what the forest should be delivering. If we then look at timber prices as an alternative, and then data go all the way back to 1900, then we can see that they are surprisingly stable in the long run. So we don't see this increase in value as we do for the other ones. What does that imply? Well, first of all, it implies that this focus we have today of delivering multiple services from the forest, that's getting increasingly important. And one thing is, of course, how that conflict with wood production, because wood production is a marketed good that the landowner has responsibility for, but the other ones might be equally valuable. So, of course, this is, we want these many services from our forests, and should we then just strive to have as much as possible into it? And from an economic perspective, I would say, well, that depends on what is actually the value of this diversity or multifunctionality, and what are the costs of obtaining these. So if we look into the debate of land sparing and land sharing, then I made this figure here basically saying we could have one product here which could be wood, low wood production and high wood production, and then we could put biodiversity up here. And there would be some kind of negative relationship between those two, indicating that it's a trade-off between biodiversity conservation and wood consumption. If we then think of the argument for multifunctional forests to kind of handle both aspects, well, then it's probably because this randomly drawn graph and relationship here is maybe looking something like this. We might actually get quite a bit of biodiversity if we just decrease the wood production a little bit, or if we just take a little bit of timber out of an otherwise very natural forest, well, then we might get a large increase in economic benefits. But if we then go in and say, well, but it's not only quantities we are looking at here, there are also qualities in these. And by qualities, I put up a measure of value. So then it could be a high biodiversity value. What I'm implying here is to say, well, there are some species, for example, that are more important than others, for example, because they're endangered. Likewise with wood products, we could think of very high quality wood and very low quality wood products, like the bioenergy aspect that we were looking at. Well, in that case, it might actually be looking more something like this. If these high specialized values, that if you take species that are specialized and are not present in the managed forest, well, then they may have a very high value because we don't have a lot of unmanaged forest, for example, in a country like Denmark. And because of that, they have a high value because we haven't got many of them. And that's why they're endangered. So that, the question, and I think the problem that we are having when we look at this is we don't know the relationship. We don't know the biophysical relationships. We also know surprisingly little of what are the costs of provisions for these different ones and what are the values. I just put value there, right? But I don't have any measure on the scale. I just draw the figures randomly. But to actually take the decision, we need to know much more about this. So what does that actually mean then for what economic arguments do we have for land sparing and what economic arguments do we have for land sharing? And again, I would like to acknowledge that there are many other arguments we could put up, right? I just try to emphasize the economic ones. And the one for land sparing, well, if we talk about very specialized product, so it could be endangered species, or it could be very high quality veneer logs where you have to go in and carefully manage the trees. That, if they require land sparing to be delivered at all, well, then and they have a high value, then land sparing might be wise. Also, if we are having irreversibility, just in terms of that there are some of the values that are lost if we don't continue, well, then we might to conserve them even if they have a little value today. And I think going back to this discussion we had yesterday of are we managing the forest for today or for the future? Well, then especially I think this comes into many perspectives, and both from a biodiversity perspective, we can say, well, we should conserve more forests for endangered species, even if we don't know if they can survive in a managed forest, if we know they can in an unmanaged. But it also goes to the production side. Should we actually sacrifice the timber, the future possibility of having high quality timber for the future generations, even if today we can see that other types of values are very important? So it goes both ways. We cannot produce high quality veneer logs in 10 years' time if the market changes. And then there's also the costs, because the production potential varies, but so does the values. And if you take an example, you would like some Danish examples on this. Some of you have earlier heard yesterday that in Denmark there's a policy now of setting aside a large share of the Danish state forests. A few colleagues of mine back in 2016 made a study showing that if we want to conserve the most biodiversity the cheapest possible, that's actually not a very wise strategy. Because the biodiversity, so the study, what they did was they looked at complementarity of species, and then what is the cost of provision. And it also costs money to set aside state forests, because there's an opportunity cost, there's a lost income. So what they went out and said, and we have been repeating since, is that, well, you could actually do this cheaper if you did it on private land as well. It might still be a wise solution to do it on state forests, because it's the politically most feasible one, but it costs some extra money. So this is one of the places where I think that economics have informed policymaking, not to say that we should go that way. So when I say it's not a wise decision, it just means it's a more costly decision than we could. Otherwise, we could have spent those money on something else. Likewise, we can say with recreational values, we should not have recreational values, high recreational value everywhere. The Economic Council did a couple of years ago a report where they estimated the recreational values of all forest sites in Denmark and found out that it varies between 200 to 8,000 Danish kroner per hectare. That means that there are places where few people come and places where a lot of people come. And of course, we need to weigh the multifunctionality according to that. So these calls for land sparing. Now time is running, so I will briefly go over the land sharing, which I think we also have some economic arguments for. And the main one is that when we have multifunctionality, it increases the value per hectare, and that means that more forests will be allocated, more land will be allocated to forests. And that is, of course, a main reason. You can say if you increase the value, it becomes better to have the forest compared to other land uses, and we get more wealth out of that. And the requirement for that is that in the curve above, that we actually have a relationship that shows that this is possible. There's an aspect of uncertainty that I will skip because of time. But from an economic perspective, I think we need to look at this land sparing, land sharing aspect from a larger perspective. So we need to look not at a single site, but at a larger spatial scale, but also at a larger economic scale. Which of these goods can we get in another way? Which of these services that are being provided can we get in other ways? We lack a lot of these substitution possibilities, and we need to integrate it better. The forest economic part, we need to integrate it better with substitute possibilities in general. I think we saw yesterday, I was in one of the parallel sessions and saw some very good examples of looking into what are the effects in the larger economy, but these plays a role, and by that, I think I have still 2 minutes left, right? Yes. Then I would like to take an example again from Denmark, because you asked for focusing on that, and because I think the example shows why it's so important that we do not only look at the forest, but look at the whole society. In Denmark, we use a lot of biomass for energy consumption. What you see here is that solid biomass here constitutes 16% of our energy consumption. That means that we are the first in Europe in terms of having, we are the fifth in terms of having biomass in our energy consumption, but we are a small country with little forests, so we actually import quite a large proportion of that. That has caused a huge debate in Denmark. Is this sustainable? Can we actually do that? And well, in itself, that's not a problem, right? The forest can adapt and deliver those services. So generally speaking, that's not a problem. We know that the regrowth and that's it. But of course, we have to be aware of some of the things. It may reduce the stock, which is a problem from a carbon perspective. It's also a problem, economically speaking, because the reason we have so large a share is that we have favorized biomass over other energy sources, other green energy sources, because when those rules were implemented, that was the cheapest way to do green energy. Now, if you look at it without taxes, it's cheaper to do wind power and solar energy. So it actually means that we have a larger share than what is cheapest for society if we want a green transition. That's not a problem in itself, but of course it's waste of money, waste of society's well-being. And then, of course, the question which comes back to the figure I showed of a large increase in energy production also in Denmark, does it come at the cost of carbon stock, but also biodiversity impacts? Because we have this large share of imported biomass, it also means we need to look at where does this biomass come from. Last week there was a huge media coverage of Denmark importing wood for burning from Brazil. Are we actually sure that this is sustainably used? How does that impact indirect land use changes? We can only look at those patterns if we actually go above looking at forest itself and see how is that actually integrated into the societal drivers and the substitution patterns, both in the marketed but also in terms of the non-marketed goods. I think that was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jette. Yeah. There's a question from the audience on the left side. The microphone is coming.
Thanks a lot. I'm Peter Elsässer from the Institute in Hamburg. Thanks a lot for your very concise and interesting presentation. When you showed that slide with the relation between biodiversity and wood or ecosystem, yes, this one. I was wondering why that is so. You say that we know surprisingly little about the relationships. I was wondering why. And I think there are three possible answers perhaps we could discuss. One is that those people specializing in biophysical relations are not interested in this question simply because it is an economic question. That could be one answer. The other is that you have presented a linear line there as a relation. Mm-hmm. It might be nonlinear, like you have presented. So perhaps we are using for analysis the wrong functional forms. Mm-hmm. And the third possibility is that in some cases, for example, recreation, there is simply no relation.
Yeah, I think from the recreational, I mean, if we along the axis did not have wood and biodiversity, but had recreation and, I don't know, wood, then I think we are looking at, I mean, this figure would be topic specific, right? And I think you're right that we could have other relationships. Non-linear ones are the ones that I tried to draw with the blue and the red ones. I mean, why we don't know about these things? I think it has, some of the things changes over time. So again, if we go back, it has long been said that people who go to the forest, they don't like to look at messy forest, they don't like to look at dead wood. We recently did a study in 10 different European countries where we asked for values of dead wood in the forest, and we actually see that across those 10 different countries, it's actually something that people look at positively. It's not published yet, so we have to wait until we finalize it later this year. But if these things are changing, how we look at that. And I think that is also what goes into the values. How do these values changes over time? And our perception of it is changing. So that is one thing. And why we don't know much about this, I think a lot of it is because the biophysical research is, I mean, there are specific studies looking at details of this, but it's not something you easily do a plot about and then you have the result in 5 years. It takes a long time, so I think that's part of the reason. And that's probably also why we often end up in these very polarized discussions of what, for example, what kind of biodiversity is it that we would like to preserve, which matters a lot for each of these graphs that we are looking at.
Yeah, I would allow one more question there. The left side.
Sven Wunder from EFI. A great presentation, Jette. We had agreed before that if you didn't have time to talk about part of your things, then I'll ask you a question about it, so you have the chance to do it. So, uncertainty was one thing you skipped, and you had that as an argument on your land sharing slide. But I could also think of it as an argument for land sparing. If you have, for instance, uncertainty about, how large an area you need to preserve a certain biodiversity asset, you may want to stay with what you have. It seems to depend to some extent also what is your initial situation. If you have a system that is working more or less well for a certain purpose, let's say either a multifunctional forest or, at the other hand, a completely well-preserved natural forest, then maybe the most certain thing is to stick with what you have and only change it marginally. Yeah,
I think you are right in that. I think what I would look at is that has a lot to do with if there's uncertainty and we cannot go back. So if you stick to a precautionary principle, that's something we would typically do if we have irreversible problems. And there I would also say that would exactly be an argument for land sparing. Where I think it goes into in the land sharing is that often we think of, especially in a portfolio perspective, we think that, well, if we have a little bit of everything, we will in general do fine. But that can be costly sometimes to have a little bit of everything because you don't do the best in one. So if we actually go out sometimes and say, well, but this portfolio is not something we only have to look at within the forest or even within the stand. It's actually something we can diversify outside the forest and in other economic activities. So if you think of it, you might go for a very risky type of forest management, but if you then have an investment outside the forest that is really safe, that might be as good as having two half-safe investments in the forest. So I think that depends a little bit on which perspective we take, where I think from a portfolio perspective is saying how can we diversify our risk, then I would say it's probably mainly an argument for land sharing. If we talk about how do we handle the uncertainty of things that are irreversible, well, then it's more a question of land sparing.
Yeah. Thank you very much again, Jette, for your talk, also for highlighting the need for a more interdisciplinary research. We'll have Klaus on the panel now. Yeah.
Thank you for the organizers to giving me this opportunity to talk, and it's really nice to follow Jette because I think I fill in some aspects that probably put her talk in a different perspective. But before we get going, we had some discussions about birthdays yesterday. Today is my wife's birthday on that. So I need your help to get me out of trouble. I told her to look at the live stream. I'm not sure it's in the middle of the night, but then actually watch the taping on that. So I need to all yell with me, "Happy birthday, Maureen." Are you ready? Happy birthday, Maureen. Good deal. That'll make my return trip a lot more pleasant. So I'm going to talk today about silviculture research, and with one of my ex-students as a co-author who just started a job at Mississippi State. And before I get going on it, I know with an audience like this, I should define what is silviculture. On that, we have the official definition here on the left by the Society of American Foresters. And if you look closely here, it talks about needs and values. It talks about ecosystem services. That's an important part of this. And on the right side, you see in a typical even age stand some of the activities that silviculturists use in that. And I guess when I give talks to some young student groups and stuff, what do civiculturists do? I kind of boil it down to get the kids' attention sometimes. If you're a civiculturist, you get to decide in the forest who's to live and who's to die. And in some ways it comes down to that decision. But so giving you some idea, it's really taking all that information from political, social, ecological aspects and then coming down to the decision to put a tree there and not there, or take a tree away, or take some other vegetation away, or not away in this kind of session. So I should point out that civiculturists, when we do our civiculture research, for the longest time, we've really focused on the biophysical structure, stand structure and composition. And that's been the main focus, even with stand dynamics on that. And obviously, for those people that you're probably familiar with the cascade model on that, that's not the same as ecosystem services on that. And that's something to keep in mind, and I'll discuss some implications of that down the line. And so when I think about civiculture research, and some of you may know that I've been quite critical of traditional civiculture research, but by definition, actually, civiculture in the US, we work at the stand level. And stand level, by definition, Society of American Forestry, is a homogeneous vegetation unit. So we've already packaged a bunch of baggage in it, which has been a strength of civiculture in the past. We've made things very efficient to manage for a limited set of objectives. But it's also, of course, becoming a weakness when you deviate from your assumptions and your goals in the setting. And also, I should point out, a lot of the civiculture research, there are some exceptions, I'm generalizing clearly. I've really focused on comparing treatments on that. And so that could be from one species versus the other, different amounts or types of weed control, the whole thinning study, what's the optimal density, and then some spatial arrangement. And here's actually an example of one of the studies I'm involved in. You have the control in the upper right, then a low intensity thinning, a higher intensity thinning, and then here is some spatial variation of the thinning where we utilize gaps in this kind of setting. And so the problem that at least people criticize these studies for, we didn't start out with an hypothesis. They started out with, well, we have this issue, we want to restore a certain stand structure. There are 4 ways or 3 ways we can do it. Let's compare on that. So it's really treatment driven in this kind of setting. And the topic, of course, that people studied is really the topic of the day, so to speak, as we go through. And pointing here in the Pacific Northwest, we had 1991, the spotted owl was listed. It changed management as we know it suddenly, at least on public land, federal land specifically. We couldn't do the standard operation, which would be a clear-cut spray and plant Douglas fir operation in the region. And suddenly, there was lots and lots of money for research. And you can see here, if you look at all these letters here, those are all research study sites that were put into place at the time. Tremendous amount of investment, tremendous amount of land. I think the studies I'm involved in, I'm coming a little over 1,000 hectares of study sites. So of course it's the US, everything is a little bigger, right, on that. But I want to point out that there was this huge influx of civiculture experiments to really study about how can we manage forests, especially those plantations that people put in the 60s, 70s, that they pushed very aggressively towards Douglas fir. How can we restore some of the old growth features, late successional habitat in it? And that was this theme for all of these studies in the case. And the beauty, of course, when you work with large-scale studies is you can measure a lot of different stuff. And that's really, I guess, getting to the idea of ecosystem services. Here on the list are the labels for all these studies that I showed you on the map. And here you can see the response variables that were measured for each one of these studies. And this is a few years old, so there are now a few more even. And so when you see on top, of course, the standard stuff that you saw in the past, there was the vegetation on that, specifically tree growth and stuff. But then as you go down the list, you can see from lichens, mammals, deer, small mammals, especially anything that is prey for the spotted owl, of course, got a lot of attention on that. a big investment into songbirds, reptiles, amphibians. I've been involved in various riparian studies where we investigated those. And it just goes down the line, including some microclimate and even social perceptions, where they did surveys on which type of these management is more attractive to the general public in this setting. So the reason I bring this up is this type of information is out there, maybe not at this scale everywhere, but in silvicultural research that's out there that could be used to assess ecosystem services and multiple ecosystem services. Silviculturists in the past, we've focused on stand structure and composition. In fact, actually, when I worked on this, the first couple of publications were on the understory vegetation, and finally, one of my colleagues said, have you looked at the tree growth? How did they respond? Which I thought was really not that interesting per se. And when I said, yeah, I haven't looked at that yet, that's coming down the line, the answer is, well, what kind of silviculturist are you? Right? You got to look at tree growth and regeneration on that. But at least with these studies, there's been a lot of information out there, and that's really ripe for the picking to start thinking about calculating proxies that relate these kind of information out there to ecosystem services on that. And actually, Austin Himes, my co-author, I think that's one of the first projects he's starting as a new assistant professor in Mississippi to go through the literature and think about a meta-analysis with this kind of stuff. And if you go through it in Europe with the history of studies, you may not have the opportunity to look at songbirds per se, because you need 10 plus hectares of a treatment area to get a couple of home ranges in. But there's a lot of information out there that I think is right for the picking for people that calculate proxies and relate it to ecosystem services. And just one example in terms of the understory vegetation, a few years back I had a student working on that. We went through the understory vegetation, we sorted it through in terms of functional traits. Christian Messier mentioned that, and we actually looked at all the species that fed the pollinator food chain, that fed the songbird food chain, and then that had palatable leaves, the deer and elk food chain on that. And looked at the traits for those, and then subset of those, which ones are drought tolerant, fire tolerant, and tolerant to increased temperatures, and basically came up with a conclusion in terms of adaptive capacity that if we manage a certain way, we improve the likelihood that these ecosystem services are provided, even if the future gets hotter, drier, and we have more fires in this kind of setting. And actually that's brings up a good point. At least I am giving a talk next week in Potsdam. And really, as I go through that in terms of adaptation managing for adaptive capacity is a supporting ecosystem service, if you look through that, at least according to the IPCC. So it should be part of this package when we think about ecosystem service. And we have this information out there. I mean, this is just simple plant cover estimate that there are lots and lots of studies out there that have that information. And if you tie it to an ecosystem service, in this case we did it in a climate change context, the information is out there from those studies that can provide us some information about well, which ecosystem services are supported and where. This is a table that came out of Austin Himes' thesis on that, and what you see is he looked at monoculture 2 and 3 species mixtures on industrial forest land in an operational setting. And you see here we have calculated proxies for various ecosystem services here and matched them up on that. You see the same services on the top here and on this side. And so if the box is yellow, that means those two services here, like herbivore forage and edible medicinal and decorative plants, they are positively related. So Jette had the line that showed the negative between the two. There are some of them that go in sync. So anything that's yellow is a positive match for him. Anything that's red is a negative match for him. That is where we have that relationship that Jette showed. And then we have the plus minuses where there was no clear. Parts of it were positive, parts of it were negative. It didn't really line up cleanly in that. So I aligned them in some ways. You see here, there's this group of yellow and red patches. And if you look closely, there's this group of yellow patches here. And those are all ecosystem services that we can relate to a specific component of stand structure and composition. In this case, those are ecosystem services that all relate to the understory vegetation in this kind of pattern. You look at the second patch down here in yellow, those are ones that relate to the overstory itself, timber revenue, carbon stock, and the merchantable volume and this stuff. So they go in sync as well. Then we have the red group there. Those are all ecosystem service measures where one of the ecosystem services is driven by the understory, the other one is by the overstory. So, and then of course the last one is when we look at scenic beauty. Scenic beauty is an integration of lots of different components on that, and it showed that it basically doesn't align with anything per se. It's its own unique type of setting. So this gives us some idea that when we talk about which ecosystem services are better suited for land sharing versus a land sparing type of setting on that, clearly this tells us, if you are dealing mainly with the yellow related ecosystem services, those are services that probably a land sharing type of approach would work quite well. If you look at the red component, and those are your main ecosystem services, for those probably a land sparing system may work quite well on that. So it kind of helps us kind of figure out under which conditions, which demands we can supply in that kind of setting. So there is no one size fits all, obviously. And to me, the interesting part is, if these patterns hold, this came out of his work, but if these patterns hold, that we can link group ecosystem services based on some of their physical linkage on that. We don't have to do studies and measure every single one. We can probably combine that, and it helps us to decide under which conditions, where in the landscape at one time, you're better off sparing or you're better off sharing or not. I'm pretty sure that one of them will not fit everywhere on that. And this will help us with that kind of setting. So talking just a little bit about silviculture research for the silviculture researchers now. I had developed a longer section that I actually cut out in the limit of time, but to me, forward-looking novel silviculture research, we have to think about ecosystem services and bring them in as well. Silviculturists have avoided that, and I've been in many discussions, like even when I put an economic value on some of my results, our landowners all say that, no, don't bother, we're running our own economics anyway on that. And so we didn't deal with that. But if we bring it forward and are forward-looking, we really shouldn't get away from this idea of comparing different treatments and really think about output-driven silviculture research. And what I mean with that is in this a little more complicated figure, you have this axis here is an environmental gradient, so from dry to moist maybe. A treatment gradient, here's your silvicultural treatment, a line along this one. And here is the trade-off between different silvicultural ecosystem services, sorry. So the yellow line here is around 0. That means you have both, if you match them with 2, I guess you can, it's tough enough to display a 3D graph, but you can multiply that out to n-dimensional hyperspace if you want. But you have regions where both benefit mutually, and then you have regions in this where one of the ecosystem services here, I guess I call it ecosystem service 1, benefits to the cost of the other, and the blue region here is the other way around, ecosystem services benefit, but you lose out on ecosystem service 1. So if I had to start my career now, and I would be interested in this in terms of silviculture research, I would probably start with some kind of figure like this and saying, what is my best, most efficient research approach to populate this figure on that? I know I have monocultures. I can push them on the edge here. I can tie those down quite easily. And then how can I decide, what shape the service is, whether we have that linear declining function that Jette showed, whether we have some kind of other functions in that as well. And if we do that, I think then we can put the horse before the cart, because in the end, as kind of was pointed out, in the end, we're not managing forests for stand structure, for diameter distributions that silviculture is worried about. We're managing it for the healthy, happy people on that long, in the broadest sense. So I want to kind of point out, I kind of made a statement that, perfect, that there's a lot of potential with data already out there. There's a lot of potential for future research. And just a few caveats and limitations that I want to highlight. One of them is, of course, this link that we worry about the cascade effect that we don't bring in there. And so we have an example of that is we have research results that tell us, at least, or even empirical results, the habitat for spotted owl hasn't really declined in the last 20 years. Since the Forest Service stopped cutting, the habitat for spotted owl has been fairly stable. If you just look at stand structure, spotted owl is going down and on its path to extinctions, and that's because we have a barred owl coming in and replacing the spotted owl. A little bigger, a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more of a generalist. So really pointing out that information that silviculturists provide, yes, we can manage for this habitat, we can provide this habitat. It needs to be put in the context of the cascade issues, that other factors may be driving it. In the case of spotted owl, negative, but it could be also, of course, positive. Another thing to consider is the spatial scale. Silviculture research, even if I have my 150, 150 hectare study site, in 1994 it looked like this. Our thinning treatments were an island in an unthinned world. The neighboring land, private land, in the meantime have been clear-cut with one exception. Now our controls are the island in a clear-cut world in the setting. And when we look at bigger things like songbird population, we find out that what we did there is not the only driver of songbird population in providing that ecosystem service. Some of them will benefit from the opening, and our research results will underestimate that. Other species actually have been disappearing despite us maintaining habitat on our study sites. And so again, something to keep in mind. The last point is that we have the same issue about time on that. When we do silviculture research, when we plant trees, we make an investment in the future, we make some assumptions about future markets. Jette pointed that out as well on that, and what is in demand of ecosystem service or not. And that may or may not be the case on that. We have the movie on that. To me, I really got a kick out of it. You can get nature relaxation on demand now. So we don't need to go in the forest anymore. So if you manage for a certain ecosystem service, our silviculture results that tell us we have an attractive forest that people like to go in, it may not play out that way. Our results may or underestimate that. So I hope I pointed out that there's some great potential there. That even from the traditional silviculture research, there's more potential if we really focus our research designs on ecosystem services and quantifying trade-offs in that kind of setting. But any information that comes has to be filtered, has to be put in the context of cascades, of space and time issues. And just the last thing to keep in mind, of course, we think we got things figured out, even what ecosystems are on that. We ain't seen nothing yet, so we got to be flexible and adaptive to move our research and our experiments in the future as well. Thank you.
Yeah, you were still in time, perfectly in time. 1 second, you had 1 second left. So that was quite impressive.
I wasted a second.
Thank you very much, Klaus. Now we will allow for 1 or 2 questions to make sure we will still in time for the next presentation. Comments or questions? Well, if there are no, then I would suggest to allow maybe one, like if there's one question. If one question comes up in the meantime, oh, there is one. You just have to wait a couple of seconds. Please wait until the microphone comes for the live stream.
Thank you. Bo Larsen from Denmark. Thank you very much for an impressive presentation. I think you are touching most of the crucial issues here, but you are working mainly in the US with semi-natural systems, whereas here in Europe we are working a lot with very unnatural systems, not native species, monocultures and so on. And for us, I think the issue of stability, of structural stability, is extremely important. And we have a knowledge that these very land sparing systems, also the plantation systems, they have inherited a lack of stability, which of course influence the functionality and the economics. So this has to be taken into account when we are talking about sharing or sparing. Have you any opinion about that, or is that a problem in the US, how, the way to manage forest in order to safeguard stability and thereby functionality?
Yeah, thank you for the question. If you make it to Potsdam next week, I'll spend a lot more time actually not talking about stability, but talking about adaptation to the future. And in fact, I feel, again, picking on silviculture, I guess I'm still a silviculturist, I can do that. We've been way too much backwards looking on that. And I kind of hinted yesterday already in some discussion. That's a real strength that we have the long tradition on that, you know, the idea of resilience. But times are changing, and we ain't seen nothing yet. So we really have to start looking forward-looking on that. And so, you know, rather than looking at how can we keep things stable, I think my push has been to how can we change things that no matter what happened in the future, and I'm not talking climate change, which is somewhat predictable, I'm talking about the global change issues, the surprises that happen on that, how we can we set things up that in the future things are not stable, but change in a way that still provides the ecosystem services. That's been our big discussion on that.
Yeah, thank you very much then, Klaus. And I would, if I would still say if a question to Klaus comes up during the next presentation, there might be a chance to ask one final question at the end. But we'll also have some kind of conclusion marks from Georg. He might also add some feedback to your presentation now. Pierre, please. Now we'll have the last presentation for this morning plenary, and you have the floor, Pierre.
Yeah, thank you very much, Klaus, for the presentation and also the last discussion. Maybe we can elaborate a little more on that during my talk and in the discussion afterwards. If we look at the forests worldwide, sometimes feel that we cannot see the ecosystem for the trees. We talk about multi-functionality, but of course we are interested in certain functions and certain services, so we optimize landscapes, remodel landscapes for, especially provisioning ecosystem services. So we replace biodiverse ecosystems by simplified well, monocultures, plantations, it has been just mentioned. And this changes, well, not only the species composition, it's not only a problem of conservation, but it changes, well, the site conditions and the overall functionality. So we see this overall happening here in Germany, just an example of a monoculture landscape, well, shaped by one species, by pines. And of course, we are well aware of the fact for a long time that these monocultures are vulnerable. And this is what we're observing now in times of climate change, extreme weather events, extreme summers, and so on. So, yeah, we see that they burn, we see dieback of well, monocultures. And then, well, we now start to think about creating new forests, new ecosystems, and the question is if we are not worsening the situation for well, the functionality of the ecosystems. I'm talking about this, well, maybe without having a good understanding as a society that uses these terms in the everyday language of what this represents. So we are facing enormous challenges, very clear, and conventional approaches might not work anymore. So traditionally replacing, reforesting tree stands is definitely not getting new functional ecosystems. So there is this growing discourse on nature-based solutions, and sometimes I wonder what this is about. But of course, we depend on nature anyway. Our food is coming from nature, any products and our living conditions. But of course, conservationists try to, well, promote this language to show maybe it's not about sharing or sparing, so maybe we are missing the point. Conservation is not about having something that is also nice to see, like biodiversity, but it's about, yeah, the very function. Ecosystem-based solutions, this is a little bit more specific, under the roof of nature-based solutions. And again, sometimes I feel, well, then it's not really reflected about what ecosystems are. So, sorry, just back to the basics for a minute. Ecosystems, what a clever term. Yeah, invented 85 years ago by Arthur Tensley without knowing many things that nowadays populate our concepts of ecosystems. Oikos, the house, but not only the house, the household, the husbandry, which is arising as emergent property of this complex system, comprising components that do something together. And yeah, then we know now it's about these interactions of components in the ecosystems that represent fluxes of matter and energy. Yeah, maybe we should remind this all the time. And for a couple of decades already, colleagues complain about well, misconceptions and misapplications of the term. So for decades, we have discussed ecosystems increasingly as husbanding entities, husbanding materials and water, but especially energy. And this goes to the core of functionality of ecosystems. Here, just referring to the works of Ilya Prigozhin, Nobel Prize winner, who showed like this well, marvelous property of ecosystems to create order out of chaos by handling energy and representing dissipative structure. So this could go now deep into physics. I won't go too deep into that, but I think it would be good to really remember what this is about. Ecosystems are not an abstract construct in our mind. They are really existing entities that are, well, biological systems that exist in informed networks, and they handle energy, or as physical scientists say, exergy, which is actually the interesting energy, the energy with which you can still do work. And by handling energy, ecosystems move away from the so-called thermodynamic equilibrium, and this means existence, this means functionality, this means sustainability. And if we really go deep into this, and then we will understand biodiversity is not something nice to have, which also occurs and has been produced by biological evolution, but it is a very key attribute to functionality. Yeah, the more informed the networks, the more information in the systems, the longer the pathways that are used for dissipating energy, the more exergy is stored, and going through the system, the higher the work capacity of the ecosystems. So Klaus has been already talking about the cascade. It's also worth looking at this again. So we have the components that make up the system, the interaction, then it's getting interesting. The interaction mean processes, and we get a functional systems, which is mainly a bioreactor, where we have an input and output, and efficiency matters a lot. It's one of the key parameters for which systems have been selected on a species level, but also on an ecosystem level. So we have emergent properties, and of course the humans then are part of the ecosystem, and they try to harvest some of the output. And then it's a question how much, and different types of services that are the consequence of the functioning ecosystem. So from a conservation perspective, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is most important? Is it the components? Is it the parts? For a long while, conservation has been targeting single species, threatened ones, rare ones, beautiful ones, and there is, of course, a certain paradigm shift, but still we have this being very relevant. Yeah? Or is it more important the function of the system we should go for, and then what does it mean actually for conservation, and what does it mean in ecosystem management? Or are the human interests more relevant? So of course this is, a rhetorical question. Yeah, it's the ecosystem functionality. And then if we follow these concepts of what ecosystems are, I would say it's about the energy. It's all about the energy flow, it's about the exergy stored in the system, the work capacity that then will have additional outcomes, which is not just producing, but also getting systems that are resilient and resistant. Just an image here on something that is worrying us a lot these days and years, the dieback of trees. This is beach dieback caused by drought and the extreme summers in the last 2 years. And we see, ecosystem functionality does not necessarily mean stability, but all the biodiversity means also there are options to come back, to resist partly. So if we look here at this picture, there are some green trees still in the hot summer in Hainich National Park, where the beach dieback was observed, and these are not beaches. So there are other tree species coming in, and we can observe this also here on the ground, where actually even the small beaches have been dying back. So there's a systemic collapse kind of beach. It's extremely interesting, not well understood, but then there are other species like Tilia and Capinus and so on not being affected. So here we see an ecosystem at work trying to adapt to extreme events. So ecosystem theory, system ecology, tells us there are certain key attributes that are relevant, that increase the work capacity of ecosystems, and this is mainly related to biomass. It's about the information, and it's about the network. So it's not only about having as many species as possible on site, but really intact, integrated systems where these species work together. And then, as emergent properties, we get, efficient handling of resources, the husbanding entity, but also resistance to a certain degree to disturbance, and then resilience when this disturbance has become so severe that the system has to repair to further develop and evolve. And this only works if there's an integratedness and coherence in the system. So this is the theoretical concept. The question is, can we bring this down to empiry? Is there research that shows, yes, we can measure ecosystem functions, and there's something, we try to do here in forests and pine plantations in northeastern Germany, where we assess structures, like the components, the processes, and also some proxies that tell us something about the functions. And here we focus on, regulating functions that are pretty interesting in times of climate change, cooling and temperature buffering. So we have been measuring for the last years at many plots with data loggers and see relationships between the properties, the structures of the system, and the function. So we have here actually the temperatures. It's the mean maximum temperature at forest plots during the hottest days in 2018. We had 45 days above 20 degrees Celsius mean temperature, and what you see here is the biomass in cubic meter per hectare, and here we have different forest plots, and we see a relationship. So the more biomass, the cooler the forest. And there are here different types of forests. So down here we have actually some beech forests that may function differently, but all this is simple pine monoculture. So even within a simple structure, biomass matters and changes it. It's not only the biomass, it's also things like canopy coverage, for example. This is the same graph here with canopy coverage, and there's again a correlation explaining a certain, the performance of the systems. And what you see here is the enormous difference among the biomass richest and most covered plots and the poorest. So we have a difference of 8 degrees Celsius on the hottest days, which should matter a lot in terms of productivity of the forest, but also, ecosystem services produced if we were interested in these. This is the graph for 2019. You see almost equally hot as 18. This is the stand level, but then we can move on. So we have to work across scales and look at the landscape, and then we can study surface temperatures, for example. This is the region north of Berlin. Mean temperature in the summer, actually June, July, August, for 12 years, 13 years. And we see the red spots here, the heat island Berlin, above 30 degrees, and then other areas, below 20 degrees mean temperature during the day in summer. And then, of course, we could ask ourselves what drives the difference, and you start to imagine, yes, there will be some lakes, which are blue here, cooling structures, but then all these patterns here indicate forest. So indeed, we see that forests cool the landscape a lot, several degrees, even at this resolution, which is 1 square kilometer. So they are more or less in the same league as the water bodies. Yeah? And then there are differences, of course, between deciduous forests and conifer plantations. And then this can kick off some reflections about what we might be interested in the future, when we have this climate change rolling over. And we know some systems can at least buy us some time, cool us down for some more years. 8 degrees, 4, 5, whatever, is quite something if we look at the current level of heating. So we have been also discussing this with colleagues from economy, and they say, well, this is not an ecosystem service. Is it? I mean, there is a service only if there's a demand for it. But if we look at the economic losses that, well, have kicked off and that we will see ever more frequently in agriculture, in the landscapes where the water is missing and which is creating so much problem. So the question here is there a new role for forests, actually, especially in the field of ecosystem services that are regulating services. So far we see, well, people have been especially interested in the biomass, tragically reducing one of the key attributes of the system. So by using an ecosystem service, the provisioning one, we drive down the functionality of the forest ecosystem. And of course, in times of, well, heating up, of times of climate change, the question is if we shouldn't be interested a little more in resistance and resilience as well. For the forest itself, for tree biomass production, but also related or impacted systems that can be benefited by the forest in agriculture. So this is, I guess, a type of thinking we need to intensify. And you've seen, maybe I'm not here exclusively talking about conservation research, but it's ecosystem-based research where we might find, well, what conservationists are interested in, the functionality of systems, it should be the same that foresters are interested in. So it's the functions that are especially relevant in times of climate change, where we need to safeguard that these ecosystems, well, really can work as self-organizing systems. And here we see all the synergies with adaptation to climate change and sustainable landscape management. So in forestry, we see, well, actually, if you leave more wood, dead or living wood, it's cooler. So, but then, yeah, it's a conflict, very clearly. Yeah, regulating services and provisioning services, you can't get them all at the same extent. And so this is something new we have to discuss and ask ourselves, okay, if we allow ecosystems to develop the soils and the microclimate and so on in the long run, maybe this is more important. So I see the new paradigm coming that we have to focus on water. Ecosystems are energy handling entities, but they maximize and optimize harvesting and storing and recycling water. If this is all true, so yeah, we have to talk and maybe need a new focus for forestry. But then, yeah, if wood is good in the forest, then there are limits to use, and we need sufficiency strategies. Last slide, it's the outlook to the future. You know these graphs by Ed Hawkins. Year by year, country by country, worldwide, we see we are heating up this world, and it's happening in a non-linear way. And so where are we going to? Complete uncertainty. I don't know how the forests will look like in the future, but I know they should be as cool as possible and have as much water as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre, also for highlighting the difficulties between forestry and forest conservation. This is one of the most important issues that we're discussing at this conference here. Oh, this is my phone, so you're right in time. But also thank you for offering us a new paradigm. So something constructive. Now I would like to open the floor for questions. And I was expecting some, so I can already see, I can already see 4. We have 10 minutes for discussion left, so I would like to have 2 questions, and then you can answer, and then the other 2, and you can answer again. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. My name is Johannes Eichhorn from Göttingen. You started with a physical approach of ecosystems, like thermodynamics, And later on you mentioned resilience and you mentioned adaptability. And for me, in my understanding, this concept of adaptability is a very important point to understand ecosystems. And therefore, I would like you to, maybe you could point out what is, in your sense, the importance of adaptability in forest ecosystems a little bit more.
Yeah, one more question, and then would you please raise your hands again? I know that there were 2 questions on this. Yeah, maybe because you're standing right there, Christoph.
Good afternoon. Good morning. I'm Christoph Razio from IEFC, and I wanted to point that your presentation could be a good definition of the resilience concept. And the problem we have with the resilience concept, if we consider that the structure can change, but the function remains the same, it's very difficult to explain to society, because society is used to a landscape and want to keep it. So can you advise us on how to pass these messages?
I'm not sure if I got this, if I can advise, sorry for
how to pass the message to society that resilience is not a matter of structure, the forest can change, but providing the same services.
Yeah, good, thanks. Okay, so yeah, coming back to your point, indeed, I think we should look deeper into physics and recognize that ecosystems are about energy, and climate change, to a large extent, is an energy-related problem. So we have an additional input of energy, and it matters a lot where this energy can be stored away or at least buffered away for the time being. So this is related to adaptation, I guess. Adaptation for me is nothing else than buying some time. So we always have to acknowledge if we run into this extreme warming, so there will be limits to adaptation and adaptability also in the natural ecosystems. And what is worrying, of course, is the velocity of change. But indeed, I would say don't look too much at single species, at components, but look at the processes and structures that allow for, having various options. So this is obvious, the biodiversity, more species and so on, but also the functionality in terms of integratedness, and therefore it's not relevant to just plant as many species as possible from everywhere, but really have systems that work together and handle the energy in a good way. So adaptability means all these emergent properties that are related to the change of abiotic conditions. Yeah? We should focus very much on this, like the soils are heavily underestimated. Maybe they are not, we're talking about them, but what are we doing to the forests? Yeah? So, to the soils, sorry. So this is something we would have to discuss. Yeah, maybe this as a short answer. It's all about resilience. Yes, resilience does not mean that the system returns to a state that it had before. This is not an option, but that it evolves and still maintains options for the ever-changing conditions. Obviously, I think this is easy to explain, and I would suggest also to forestry to embrace this concept much more, also the types of ecosystem services you offer. I don't see there is a conflict between forestry and conservation, but the question is, does forestry necessarily have to produce mainly timber? Yeah? Or can we explain to society now forest management produces resilience of the wider landscape and therefore resilience for society? This is my question I have also to this audience.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point that we're also tackling in the resilience program of EFI in Bonn. And communications is an important part of it, definitely. There was another question.
Jürgen Bauers from the University of Freiburg. What makes you so sure that energy and the way you quantify it is such a good indicator of ecosystem resilience? After all, you showed us some images of beech forests that are dying, that should be the coolest according to your measurements. Don't we need a much more differentiated view of assessing resilience? And what do you say to all of these studies, for example, that shows that thinning, which reduces the biomass, particularly the living biomass in forests, actually makes forests a lot more resilient to extreme heat and drought stress? After all, it matters whether you have trees on site that maintain the functionality of forests. And I would also be interested whether you have any information there on, say, that gradient that you put out there in terms of temperature measurements and mortality rates of trees, because to me, I think that would be a very important information.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm a scientist, I'm not sure. And I think we shouldn't be too sure. And I wonder what kind of evidence you have for long-term evidence showing that really thinning makes forests more resilient. So I would have serious doubts about that. Yeah. But this is within a certain time frame, under certain climatic conditions. So let's have a look in the longer term if this is really true. So what I feel is good. It doesn't make me sure, but that we have this ecosystem theory and, the physical sciences behind it, which is maturing for quite a while and which is pretty much in line with the findings. If one species shows dieback, like the beech now, this is not an argument against, I guess, the theory. Indeed, we would have even to go deeper into some details, like where is the beech dying back? Even on Hainich, it's a special, in Hainich National Park, a special situation, southwestern slopes on calcareous rocks, well-drained soils. There was forest use a few decades ago. There was thinning. So if we really honestly look at these stands, it's national park now, but we see cut stumps. So there is already a harm. Biomass and information has been reduced. The trees are not as old as they could be. There is a lack of dead wood, and the soils actually are not looking like they look in virgin or primeval forests which have never been touched by silviculture. So I guess, we need a much longer discussion on that. But I'm not sure, but you shouldn't either.
Yeah, I also wanted to suggest to Pierre and Jürgen to maybe start a joint research project to further elaborate. I unfortunately have to close the Q&A now and ask Georg to come back for some closing remarks and summary of the discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yesterday evening we had some reflection about yesterday, and we came to the point that we thought it would be very interesting that some guys in the room in these plenaries try to sum up some key points. And then this morning Bart was one of the first to come because he thought we start earlier. So I called him and said, Bart, you are very complementary to my thinking because you come more from natural sciences. So I convinced him that he notes down some points, Bart Moyes from Karel Leuven, and I note down some points. And we have now each 5 minutes before your deserved coffee break to give you our take-home message on the 4 keynotes. And I would say, Bart, come over and start. And then we see if this is a good strategy.
Let's see, I'm not sure. Well, first I would like to congratulate the 4 speakers of this morning. I thought they each brought really very inspiring talks and give us a lot of food for thought. I would also like to congratulate the organizers for not only for choosing the right people, but also for the order, because there was really a nice order where I felt that the next speaker always gave a kind of solution for a problem that raised in the previous. So let's have a look. We started with Eva, who had the political science approach, and she clearly showed from the theory of political science how political science really can help us with coping with our big challenges. Should we go to land sparing or segregation, like we call it here, or land sharing integration? And it's all about trying to understand who is here at stake, what are the power relations between those people, what are the the processes in these discussions, or in the things that are not discussed, which are behind, but or in more the taboo sphere. So, and I think her statement was really, if you want to make progress, have solutions, solve these conflicts of how to manage exactly with set-aside or non-set-aside, integrate and so on, we should really listen more clearly to the arguments of the other, understand each other, and come to solutions which are integrated between those stakeholders. And not too much play the power games. One original thing was here to not only speak about land sharing, land sparing, but also about restoration, which becomes really a big issue, certainly if we look worldwide. There you said that's something else, it's land settling. I thought it was very interesting. The graph gave me the impression that it's a move-in of a land sparing approach. There I had some doubts. What will be the management of the restored areas? I think also there we could have a land sharing or land sparing approach. And then, one of the doubts here was, what are really the arguments that people use to decide on land sharing, land sparing? Is it only about power, or also certain knowledge elements at stake, like land use legacies, what was there before, what are the biodiversity values, and so on. And then we came to Jette's talk, which says, the economic science can help us a lot about knowing where the values are. And I think she convinced us that this is not something very stable. Things change. The environment is changing. Also, what people like or need is changing. And also, the possibilities of finding substitutes for things that we find important in the forest is also changing. It's for me a scary idea to think that, in the future we don't need the forest anymore. We just play apps on our computer and we have all this beauty of the forest in our face. So, the value of the forest is lost. But anyway, I think it makes sense to think like that. I think the substitutability is really a very interesting issue. I think Jette also pointed us to the fact that we have a lot of gaps still in our knowledge and understanding of where are the values and what are the substitutes and so on. And I think Klaus came then with some solutions for that in the silviculture research. And showing that research in silviculture changed from just a stand treatment to landscape management. So opening the scope, solutions are in the landscape because time and space is very important. There's influence of what happens around. He showed that in silviculture research of the last decades, a lot of indicators have been developed. He called it proxies for stand structure, for processes, all information that we need to better understand how can we manage for multiple ecosystem services. And probably for every ecosystem service, be it nature conservation, be it recreation, be it provisioning service, be it climate change adaptation, we probably have proxies that say something that can solve the issue. Biodiversity stays a very difficult thing to tackle, to value. There's different schools, different beliefs. And then we came to the last story of Pierre Ibisch, which I like very much because I believe already a long time in a thermodynamic approach to solve our problems. I thought his discourse would be very much about conservation, but I think it was the other way around. Land sharing, land sparing, forget about it, this is not really the issue. It's about the functioning of ecosystems. We need to have stable ecosystems with functions which survive over the long term, and that's all about how systems, complex systems, manage energy, are able to dissipate disturbances, energy fluxes which come to them. And there again we need this proxies of ecosystem functioning. And he says it's not about the exact species, it's all about how they work together, form communities, which makes sense, and have this adaptive capacity of the system. I think there's a lot of truth in that. Of course, does that mean that climate systems with beach are the best solution everywhere? Of course not, Jürgen, because if you have a disturbance and the beach dies, then you need something else which replaces it, which fills the gaps. So at all times in our landscape, we need all these different stages and all these pioneer species which fill the gap. So in the end, biodiversity in all its aspects is needed. And probably also the one in the soil where we have a huge lack of difference. One problem stays for me. We have a lot of beautiful tiny species which do not seem to be have any functionality in this forest. For the thermodynamics, they don't play a role. Should we give a damn about them in our forest, yes or no? So that stays an open question, and certainly also, do we have to do that with rewilding our forest or just with very complex management systems? But I'm sure you will solve that in your discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Bart. Well, as to be expected, time is an issue, so I will try to be very short and just complement some points. First, I just share the perspective that it was very interesting, very different and inspiring talks. We still have some presents for you, but this is for in 3 minutes. Just my observation, adding on Bart, what I found interesting in Eva's talk, and that's a perspective I'm very familiar, is that many of the concepts we are talking about, they are not politically innocent, they are politically loaded. For instance, payment for an ecosystem service, environmental service, is not only about is it efficient, how is it connected, but there's a certain, in the political debate, it comes with a certain value loadedness, and with things like power relations behind there, people supporting it, people that are not supporting it. And as we don't have time to go further into that, what I found, this was quite interesting in comparing it to Jette's perspective, because both of you, Eva and Jette, were talking in the end about how do we govern forest for multiple services. But Jette, even so she said in the beginning, economics does not solve the problem. She contributed a lot with solving the problem with underlining principles of economics, utility in the center, but also cost-benefit relations, question of markets and market imperfectness. I found this both together very interesting because a solution that is cost-benefit seen efficient from an economics perspective might still be a solution that part of Eva's actors just refuse because of what you might call ideologically believed reasons. Then on Klaus and Pierre, I would just like to add that for Klaus, I found it quite inspiring, this horse before the carriage. I'm not a silviculturalist, but I understood there's a lot of criticism when Klaus talks about saying that we implicitly in silviculture seem to assume what we are researching for, and he was basically putting the question, no, you need to know, really output-oriented, what you said, what is your silviculture about? And I think that was interesting. There's a lot of connection. Also, you showed some nice examples, synergies and trade-offs of ecosystem service where your discipline can contribute in analyzing it. But there's a really nice connection to the previous talkers that were more interested in how society sees this, and a lot of chance for solving problems with putting you guys together. And then finally, Pierre, a lot has been said already. On one hand, reminding us about the ecosystem functionality, that a lot is nice, but if these ecosystem functions are not there anymore, it remains very difficult, then that's what we learned in the discussion, how you define it and what we know and what we don't know, that might create the biggest problem at all for people dealing with forest, because if the forest is not whatever it means functioning anymore, then what to do with the related ecosystem service? Then we need to go to the cinema, as Jette was proposing, and watch the movies about the forest in the future. And finally, your last slide with the big question mark. I hope that we have been making some progress towards looking in what is this question mark, but of course there is this big concern about that things are turning quite dramatically perhaps in one direction, and what can we do about it? Well, obviously that was a very short summary. I have 4 points that I see a bit cross-cutting presentations. First of all, talking about integrating forest ecosystem services, managing forests for multiple services. one question that comes from yesterday, and is also relevant today, is a bit, what are we talking about? Are we talking about ecosystem service, about forest functions, or are we also talking about people with different demands? Are we even talking about markets, bioeconomy-related forest product value chain? And that can have quite different implications on how you do this integration. If it's possible by experts saying this is this and this, or if you need to engage with society, if you need to engage with the forest-based markets, that can also be quite diverse. Secondly, scale is something that's cross-cutting a lot. I mean, just remind the presentation on Russia, and also Klaus coming from big US with big scale experiments and so on, and compare it to smaller countries like the country we are in now. Scale matters a lot. Also, when you talk about what do you integrate, do you refer to the segregation, integration? It's not black and white. There's a lot in between, and there's also the scale question in terms of time. Again, looking into that. So what kind of forest are we managing for, and what is our time scale? And are we able as humans to look into the future? Third point, context. It's connected to the scale. It's, of course, not so that in such a conference you can have the big picture afterwards and you know what to do with forests in Canada and what to do in forest in Denmark. But it's still, and I think that was one of the main ideas we have in this conference, just to bringing these different contexts and worldviews together. And last but not least, several of you used nice pictures also yesterday about context, about practice things. And this is again leading us to the field trip we have in the afternoon, that it's sometimes really interesting next to the academic debate to look a bit into different forest landscapes. And I found it quite interesting how pictures were used. For instance, Pierre, in your presentation, they had a certain message and there were others there. So let's discuss this in the afternoon in the forest and try to connect it to one picture of forestry in this country. So, well, I have a last point. My wife has birthday today. I got inspired by Klaus. So if you would all say something like, "Happy birthday, Chantal," that would also help me in my evening communication. And then enjoy your coffee.
No.
So, happy birthday, Chantal.
Chantal.
Thank you, enjoy your coffee.
No, you forgot the gifts.
Yes, we do this, but together
Okay,
with the coffee.
everyone else can go to the coffee, okay.